Connecting. Oh,
Ah,
it worked.
working. Isn't it amazing when it does for us?
It's incredible.
It's
And I suspect it will stop working at some point. We've got a plan in action. We have a backup plan, which is to go to another part of the house in case I start to get all fakakta or something. Okay?
a Brooklyn apartment, so I can see every part of my house from where I'm sitting. Kind of.
I like the vertical books. I like the vertical books very much.
Thanks. Making use of space.
So, for all the people that are on right now with us listening, I want to introduce you. I want to say that you're Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. You're a marine biologist, which, by the way,
Also,
is the coolest job I can possibly think of. I mean,
it's really cool.
Yeah.
I don't regret it. I think, yeah, I was one of those kids who, like many kids, decided to be a marine biologist as soon as I learned how amazing the ocean was. And I was like, no, this is my job now. And I was just stubborn enough to make it happen, and had parents who didn't write it off as just like a silly childhood dream. They're like, yeah, no, that seems right. The ocean could use some help, and the world needs more Black scientists. So yeah, do it.
All good. Did you learn to, were you one of those babies who learned to swim really early? Not that this has anything to do with what we're talking about today, but I'm just curious.
We're just here to chat. I learned to swim when I was 5. I grew up in Brooklyn and in class, and the one vacation we could afford to go on was when I was 5. We went to Key West, Florida, and I learned to swim. I went on a glass bottom boat and saw a coral reef, and it blew my mind.
Of course, of course, of course. And I want to tell people listening that you're the CEO of the Ocean Collective, and you're the founder of the Urban Ocean Lab, all of which I hope we talk about today, because the work that you're doing is incredible. The piece that you wrote in the Washington Post, and people can find it, I'm fairly certain, on my Instagram, certainly on yours and Twitter and so on. If you haven't read it, you should read it, because I found it to be absolutely stunning and incredibly powerful and a critical read for this moment, which is why I was hoping that you and I could do this today, and then you could take over all my social media. Frankly, for the rest of time, I have no problem with that. But anyway, it was an op-ed that Ayana wrote in the Washington Post last week or so. And I want to start by quoting the quote that you used within the piece from Toni Morrison from 1975, which goes like this: the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being.
I mean, she put it as she did many things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the quote that popped into my head as we were entering this moment a few weeks ago of all of these murders of Black people by cops, and the uprising, this like beautiful renaissance in the pursuit of racial justice that we're in the middle of now. And at first though, I was just like, how can I process this? I can't just like go on with business as usual. I can't just like charge through my to-do list happily and pretend that everything is fine. So I stopped, and for me, writing is a way that I process my thoughts. And so I wasn't initially sure that it would make sense as an op-ed, but I around this moment and connect the dots for myself between the work that I do and white supremacy and police state and mass incarceration and all of these things. And so that's kind of what led to it, just like writing out of this grief and fury and frustration, and trying to see if I could frame it in a way that would help other people understand the way that these things are connected, not just for me, but in the real world, right? Like climate change and justice and our ability to get all the work done.
Totally. And I think that it's an interesting moment. I mean, if we see this moment, which is one of great suffering, no doubt, needless to say, but also as a moment of opportunity to discuss this intersection that I think the messaging of the environmental movement has, there's a mistake they've made, I think, which is the notion of social justice and environmental justice and climate science and climate change are inextricably linked. They're just the intersection. They're like, it's like a sandwich. It's all on top of each other. And I'm not sure that that message is out there. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about, it's in your piece, but maybe you can elaborate.
So climate change is a really big problem. It's really hard to deal with sort of as it is. And right. So I empathize with the desire on the part of a lot of the traditional large environmental groups to say, like, that's enough of a problem. Like, we can't also fix white supremacy. We're trying to save the planet.
Yeah.
So I get that behind it, but there's kind of this approach that says, you know, we'll deal with that later. And that really neglects what you were saying, that they're like, you can't separate them on both the problem side and the solution side. So on the problem side, we know we have lots of data that people of color, poor communities also, are the most heavily impacted by climate change, by storms and sea level rise and droughts and floods and all of that. People who have the least get hurt the most. There's so much evidence of that. And it's the same with fossil fuel facilities. All of the power plants and stuff are often located in communities of color. Black people are, I think, 75% more likely to live in a fence line community near a fossil fuel facility. So you're having like exposure to everything that's causing climate change and all that air pollution, and then you're getting hit by the impacts of it. And then on the solution side, how are you supposed to lead your community in transforming towards climate solutions when you're dealing with all this other stuff? Right. And so I think there's this sort of double whammy there where you're trying to figure out how to deal with a really complicated problem that's first and worst hitting communities of color and poor people, even though it's coming for all of us. And then on the solution side, both there hasn't been enough effort to engage people of color, and there also just hasn't been funding for the people of color who are leading this work. And there's just not a lot of bandwidth within the Black community to be focusing on this when there's so many other like really immediate threats that people are dealing with.
Right, but except at the same time, as I understand it, Black people, Latinx people are much more concerned about the environment versus white people. That's probably because they're significantly more impacted by environmental issues, I would think. But whatever the reason, there is, shall we say, enthusiasm for the effort in those communities, right?
Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that is actually the number that sticks in my head, is that there are, so there's been polling by Yale and George Mason University over time of, you know, the demographics of the perceptions of climate change. And one of the things that they found is the latest polling data shows that there 49% of white people are concerned about climate change. That number is 57% for Black people and 70% for Latinx folks. And they don't have enough data for numbers on other races. And just looking at that, knowing that 57% of Black people are already concerned, and wouldn't it be great if we lifted some of the other burdens so they could be a part of the solution? That's 23 million Black people who are already concerned about the climate crisis. And I think that gets missing in all this. It's not that we don't care. There's of the white environmentalist, right? Like some dude in a Patagonia jacket driving a Prius, like looking off at a forest. And those people obviously exist, but there's so much more to this movement.
That. The Patagonia jacket.
Like 10 times. Wrong with that guy per se, but there's a lot more to what's going on. And I think it's the difference between like who cares about the environment and who calls themselves an environmentalist or who feels welcome into the environmental movement.
Right. I wonder how...
Comments are great.
Oh, really? I haven't even been looking at them yet. Oh, it's population. God damn it. Do you see that?
We all fine.
What?
Oh, Julia, people can't even see you.
They can't see me? What did I tell you? Can you see me? Ayana, can you see me?
I think it's a tiny bit fuzzy.
Guys, this is straight out of Veep once again. Are we moving?
Yeah, just try.
Okay, my tech department.
30 seconds to walk over
I'm going to move. Should I sign out? Wait a minute. Do you think I could sign out and then come back in? Maybe. I think I will.
It'll be 10 seconds.
It'll be 10 seconds. Okay, Ayana, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to end this, and then I'm going to come back. Stay right there. Okay. Sorry about this. Blame who's ever in charge of that. Okay. I'll be back. All right. Well, we'll see how long this lasts. Talk quick.
People might have a fuzzy face.
Let's say that again.
People might have with a fuzzy version of us here.
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever. So I forgot where we were, but hello again.
Says hello in the and that's who introduced us.
Yes. So here's a question for you. Are there any environmental organizations that are working on climate justice and promoting voices of color that you want people to know about, that you want to highlight, that you love?
Yeah. There's a few. One is the Climate Justice Alliance, which is a group of all different groups that work on climate justice. Another is We Act, which is based in New York. In the South, there's the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. Oh no, I'm being told that it's my fault that that it's blurry.
Well, if I could get my Charlie to come to your house right now, he could help you, but
why don't we have warping yet? I think we're just gonna roll with it. If people can hear me over. So we've got a fan of the Act in the comments, which is great. Yeah, there's a lot of them, and I would actually encourage people to find one that's local, because there's so much of the environmental justice, climate justice work that's happening is at the local level, dealing with local power plants, local, right? So yeah, I think.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in acting locally. I think it has enormous impact. I mean, it really, that saying is totally true, isn't it? Think globally, act locally. I mean, I know that sounds cutesy, but it actually really is the truth. That's been my experience anyway.
Good. Yeah. So I think the secret with this moment in so many ways is that people can find where they plug in, right? We all can march, and well, we can't all, but like there's marching and donating and voting and signing petitions and all the things that are sort of the general categories. And then there's like, what are you really good at? Like, what is your special skill that you can bring to the climate movement, to the justice work more broadly? I think that's the excitement of this moment. And if it's something you can do with a local group, that's great. If it's passing the mic like you're doing right now, that's awesome. So I think I always want to encourage people when they say, what can I do? I want to ask them, well, what are you good at? And like, then do that, but for the cause that you care about.
Totally. Totally. One of the big things that people are calling for in this moment is for the defunding of police, which is in certain ways, I think is kind of an oblique term because it can mean so many different things. But I wonder what you think, or what's your take on how this links up with the climate movement, that the notion of defunding police, if it in fact does.
Yeah, I think when we talk about defunding the police, we have to be talking about what we're funding instead.
Yeah.
And so I think about in New York City, the police budget is $5 or $6 billion a year. There's a lot of other stuff we could be doing with that money, right?
Yeah.
Instead of making sure that like all this insane equipment that they're using to kill people who are innocent. So for example, during the COVID-induced economic here in New York, our composting program was shut down. So we had just started curbside composting, and that was ended, which was a real bummer because people were just getting in the habit of putting their vegetable scraps there. And food waste is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, all this wasted food, and composting can be a part of the solution. So defund the police and fund, on the other hand, environmental work, help make communities safer and cleaner in other ways, fund education, fund internship programs, fund community gardens. There's any number of alternatives. So I whenever people say defund the police, it's like a yes and, right? It's how are we envisioning just a different way that we're living in community.
Right. And I think when you're talking about greenhouse gases, and I'm thinking to myself, well, I think I was watching you talk to Bill McKibben, and which is an absolutely fabulous conversation that the two of you had. I love him. And you were talking about protecting the oceans. I think it was in that conversation. Protecting the oceans in such a is so crucial and critical because the ocean will protect us, which is a really interesting thing to consider about the climate in particular. And when you consider that the ocean is like 71% of the globe, something like that, right?
Big deal. I wish people paid more attention to it.
Yeah.
I wrote 2 last one bed in the Washington. Other was an article for Science American about the ways in which the ocean is a massive part of climate solutions. And yeah, the ocean has already absorbed 90% of the heat that we've trapped by burning greenhouse gases. It's absorbed 1/3 of the CO2 that we've emitted by burning fossil fuels. So the ocean's like really trying to protect us, and we think of it as this place that's just the victim of pollution, of the heating and ocean acidification, of overfishing. But actually, there's all these solutions that we leave out for climate change if we don't think about it. So offshore energy, like wind turbines offshore, which Europe has been doing for a long time, and we're just like really slow on the jump there. Like coastal ecosystems. Someone's saying we need ocean justice. Yes, we do. Coastal ecosystems actually can absorb 5 times more carbon than a forest on land. So all this talk about replanting forests, we need to be replanting mangroves and seagrasses and wetlands too. And can be our food is a significant part of our carbon footprint, what we eat and where it comes from. So there's this huge opportunity to do regenerative farming in the and mussels and the nutrients that are already in the water. So those things.
Right.
So yeah, I want people to think as a hero and not just a victim, and include it when we think about climate policy.
So we got, by the way, I'm jumping to something because where the hell did I put this? Oh God, in all my paperwork, and I left my one room that had all my notes, and now everything's garbled. But it was a question from someone who identified themselves as a wind nerd. And they said, and how do we, I wish I could find the actual, oh, here it is. From a wind nerd, how do you feel about artificial reef potential from offshore wind farms?
So let me decode the question for the non-wind nerds in the audience. So wind turbines, when they're installed offshore, they have like a large, they have like there's a bunch of different technologies. You can either like tether them to the seafloor with ropes, or they can be have like a post that goes all the way down to the seafloor. And the infrastructure can become habitat, because fish and other species really like structure. They like to have like a home, basically. And so there's a potential, we've seen this with like oil rigs, actually, that all these different fish and other species like to live on that structure, except then there's an oil spill and like everything's toxic and it's terrible. We don't have that part of the problem with wind. So you could envision a way in which wind energy becomes like an artificial reef, as the question said, which is habitat for a lot of other things. And so when we think about offshore renewables, there's actually a potential for a double win, right? There's that wind blows much stronger and more consistently offshore. And 40% of Americans live in coastal counties, and a third of us are in coastal cities. And like New York City, where are you going to put a field of wind turbines or solar panels? There's no room, but we have all this ocean space that we could use if we choose the locations carefully, so we're not like getting in the way of whales trying to migrate or sensitive habitats. That we can actually create, a safe space for more marine life, because those places are not places where you would necessarily go fishing right near, or maybe there's not as many boats near there. So it could become like a safe, quiet place for other things to live. So there could be a double conservation benefit.
You know, that reminds me of, you've done amazing work in Barbuda, right? And developed a sort of an ocean zoning, helped them to develop, I should say, an ocean zoning program in Barbuda. Can you talk about that experience, by the way? I think that ocean zoning idea is stone cold genius. I do.
I love it. Well, it's not my idea, but I'm also a huge fan of it. I mean, because think of what we do on land, right? We have parks, we have residential areas, we have industrial areas, we have farmland, and that zoning is an important part of how we plan. But in the ocean, like in most places, we don't have a plan, which is crazy. Like, so everyone can kind of just do whatever they want, wherever they want. I'm oversimplifying it a bit, but this idea of ocean zoning, of creating marine parks and fishing areas and offshore renewable energy areas and areas for ocean farming, so that there's a place for everything, and everything is happening in the place that's best suited to it and doesn't hurt the habitat. And so in Barbuda, and particularly when I was executive director of the Waite Institute, we supported that island community, which is in the northeast corner of the Caribbean, to develop their own ocean zoning plan. So we provided the scientific research about where all the different species and habitats were. We provided some GIS and mapping expertise, some lawyers who were consulting to help them draft whatever the regulations they decided on. And it was a 2-year process of many, many community meetings and rounds of different versions of the maps. And fishermen played a huge role in determining where the boundaries are because they rely most heavily on the ocean there. And it was an incredible experience to be able to shepherd that through the process. And they actually passed comprehensive new ocean zoning that really set a model for the region. In terms of they protected a third of their waters completely, established anchoring zones so we wouldn't be anchoring on the reefs, a shipping zone so that where the boat traffic was, there weren't people, all of these sorts of things. And so I would love to see that be a model that's used elsewhere because having a plan seems like a good start. And we launched that program in Curacao and Montserrat before I left the organization, and now they've started programs in the Pacific Islands as well. So I will post soon on my Instagram, like, whoop.
Oh. You will.
Someone called me. I'll post the long description of that project on my Instagram, which describes that process and has all the maps in it for people who want to nerd out on ocean zoning.
It really does. It really does. So I want to get to some questions from people who have submitted, okay? Unless there's anything before we answer those questions that you want to talk about right now. I don't want to, if there's anything else that comes to mind in terms of, I mean, actually there is one question for you because there's the phrase anti-racist now is sort of maybe born out of this moment to a certain extent. And I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to say about that in terms of the climate movement. And I mean, you've already addressed it to a certain extent, but is there any further sort of unpacking of that notion that you want to discuss?
Yeah, I think there's this impulse on the part of environmentalists in particular, but a lot of people who say like, wait, no, I'm one of the good white people. I'm not racist. Like, I'm not causing this problem. But we live within white supremacy. We live in a racist society. So we have to actively be anti-racist if we want to change that system. It's not just enough to like not use slurs and that kind of thing. Like we have to aggressively, proactively make that transition. My co-founder for the think tank, Urban Ocean Lab, just showed up in the comments. Hi, Marquise. And so I think this term anti is great that we are starting to have language for, okay, you're not like actively racist, but you still are part of the problem if you're not part of the solution. And that applies to the environment as well. If you want to just care about climate change and not actually care about justice, then you're missing the point, because the reason that we are worried so much about climate change is because of what it's going to do to us as humans. So we have to care about other humans in creating the solutions that we're working on.
Exactly. Okay, good. Let me think. Well, here's a question that came in. I don't know who it came in from, but the question is, why are climate and racial issues so politicized? Shouldn't they be nonpartisan issues? I mean, one would think, right? And by the way, and to that point, I would add, you know, how to the Toni Morrison quote from the beginning of your Washington Post piece, this whole idea about climate deniers and people who are anti-science, they're wasting our time. They're wasting our time. There's urgent And there's
Yeah.
urgency. Racism is wasting our time. Anti-science thinking is wasting our time. We've got a lot of work to do quickly in order to save ourselves. And anyway, sorry, that's just me yakking. But
No, that's great. More. I think there's a very specific reason why we have so much climate science denial happening. And that's because the fossil fuel industry paid for that. They started think tanks and they ran massive marketing campaigns and they donated to politicians. And so you have like one of the wealthiest industries in the history of the planet really controlling the messaging around climate. Their scientists knew about climate change, the fact that we were having global warming in the 70s. Exxon knew. It was their own research. And they decided deliberately to pretend it wasn't happening because they could make a lot more money if they didn't have to deal with it, right? So I do want to emphasize that it's like, while we should each do our part, it really is a few corporations run by a small group of white men who have created this framework within which we are now forced to try to fix things. And so there's just a lot of self-interest and greed that's driving this problem. And I would argue that there's a similar problem when it comes to racism, because people don't want to give up the advantages they have. They don't want to share. There's this mindset that if Black people do better, white people will be worse off. We could just all be better off.
exactly. Yeah.
Julia, you started involved in mental work and joined the board of NRDC. What was it for you that was like your motivation, or what inspired your environmentalism?
Well, I think really for me began once I had children. And so I had my first son in the early 90s, and we had moved to Los Angeles. And I noticed they're having beach closures because I was gonna go down to the beach for a play date and hang out. And I thought, wait a minute, how could there be beach closures? That doesn't make any sense. And that's sort of how it began. And I started to work with a local organization in Los Angeles called Heal the Bay. And then, and it started there. That's how I met people at the NRDC. And I also, and then subsequently worked with other local organizations further north north of Los Angeles, Heal the Ocean, and NRDC. That's sort of how it began. And my family's always been certainly devoted to, other issues that intersect with this, like social justice issues. And we've been sort of behind the scenes supporting groups and schools who are sort of in that, who are all about social justice. And so that's how it started. But mainly it's really about, for me, having children. That kind of was the game changer. It should have been earlier, by the way. But let's see.
What group? A shout out
again?
Yeah. Which groups do you want to give a shout out to? Who's doing that work that inspires you?
I'd like to give a shout out to. Ones I just did, Heal the Bay and Heal the Ocean, both. Of course, the NRDC. I've worked for them for 20 plus years, and now I'm on the board. They're at the forefront of environmental defense, and they have a very track record. Mm-hmm. And now is a critical time for the legal work that they're doing. in addition to the scientific work that they're doing. And I'd also like to give a shout out to the Harlem Children's Zone, which is, do you know that school, Ayana, in Harlem? I don't know if it's sort of, well, it's
Probably not.
Canada.
I've heard of it.
Jeffrey Canada started it. It's been around now for a couple decades, and it's an amazing place that's really it's a all-inclusive program from educating moms and babies all the way through college, and it takes the kids in that area of Harlem who are had been so unsupported by the system, and does exactly the opposite and gives full support all the way through college. It's an amazing program, and they've had enormous success. So it's not just a K through 5 or anything like that. It's the whole kit and caboodle. And their program is being sort of imitated in many areas across the states, and happily so, because they are having enormous impact on their communities, again, locally, and that's important.
Since you mentioned NRDC, I've been really paying attention to what NRDC has been posting on social media since the murder of George Floyd and so many others, Breonna Taylor, and just, I think I've been really impressed by how they've just been like, this is our issue too. We're going to talk about this. We're going to care about this. We're going to focus our social media on this and not shy away from it, because I think there's so many groups that are like, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. And I think like it's okay to mess up right now. A lot of people are new to this conversation around racial justice and are nervous to engage. But I think this is a time of growth. And if you approach things with, an open heart and a willingness to learn and improve, then we need people to have these conversations. That's why I'm so excited to be talking to you. I think this is a moment where we all need to just process all of this change.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's an opportunity in the middle of all of this incredible sadness. It's an opportunity. We've gotten a question that's come in, which is about the current coronavirus pandemic, and how has it highlighted racial and climate justice inequality? And it certainly has done that, hasn't it?
There's, there's a lot of ways. The two that intersect most with the environment, one is that communities of color are more likely to have power plants and refineries in their communities, which means a lot of air pollution and bad air quality, we know, puts you at higher risk for worst forms of COVID. People might already have asthma or other respiratory because of that exposure. And, it's the same pollution that's killing people in that way that is, sort of warming the entire planet. And we also found out recently that that Black mothers in particular, who there's been a bunch of data recently about their higher risk of death during childbirth and other complications because of a lack of adequate medical care and other sort of socioeconomic constraints. That also, because of the poor air quality, leads to and heat stress because of climate change, is leading to more infant mortalities and other problems in birth. So Black women are just really getting the short end of the stick when it comes to the air we breathe and the health of our children and likelihood of, living through having a child. So yeah, there's a lot of different intersections, but those around coronavirus and race and the environment, there's just compounding health and economic impacts. On top of which, of course, like living in places where it's harder to access the fresh foods that would keep you healthy and all of that too. Less access to parks and outdoor spaces at this time when we are all just like cramped and shut in. And either being an essential worker or being out of work. I mean, Black businesses have been hit the hardest by this recession in terms of going out of business, and they've also least support from the federal government in terms of stimulus money. So yeah, it's a mess. So trying to pretend that these things aren't connected and that we could just like solve climate change without dealing with all these other things, or that we could just solve economic problems without dealing with climate change, or solve racial problems without dealing with the other two. I'm just like, sorry, it's just not possible.
It's not possible. And I have to say, sometimes it does feel like, oh, it's a tonnage, isn't it? But we got to do it. I saw that piece in the New York Times yesterday about the climate change tied to pregnancy complications for women of color. Okay, so let's look at some other questions that people have sent in. Hey, do you have any advice for an activist teen? Like teenagers who want to get really active?
I love this question. And what we're seeing with the climate movement in particular is that the school strikes, it's like basically led by teens, and mostly right. Teenage girls who are organizing, they're building these like massive efforts. And so my advice to teens is to join a group. There's sometimes this impulse that you have to thing or do your own thing, but there's lots of people doing this, and it's also like way more fun to do it with other people. Some of my closest friends I've met doing climate work and ocean work. You share this interest and this passion, and like people have, I've found all these people who have like a great sense of humor and are super creative, because we have to figure out all these new ways to try to get the message out there. So yeah, find a group in your community to join, and then think about what specific skills you have that you can contribute. This is not applicable necessarily only to teens, right? So if you're good at art, maybe you can do that. Technology, you can build the website. If you're really social, you can help like get people out to your events. If you're a good writer, you can, write the essays that help spread the word. So applying your skills, joining a local group, and I think living by example. We can't solve the climate crisis with individual actions. That's been one clear message from the pandemic. While we're all at home and people are traveling less, we've only had a 7% decline in emissions of greenhouse gases. So like we can't all just stop doing something. Yeah, it's only been 7%, and we need like a year until we get to zero. So that shows us we really need these big, right? We don't get to always choose where the energy comes from when we turn on the lights. So we need to shut down those coal power plants. We need to build turbines and other things. So we have in the comments, someone's mentioning Sunrise Movement and Fridays for Future are a good place to start for teens. Totally agree. Those are two wonderful
Are they
options.
both very teenager focused?
Fridays for Future is the one that was started by Greta Thunberg. So it really is focused on the teenage youth activism. Sunrise Movement was started by some kids in their 20s when they were right out of college. And they have, I think, hubs in 300 cities or more around the US. So you can probably find a local group that's near you. Yeah, those are all teenagers, people in their 20s. Sunrise has some younger folks involved too. They need to get their parents' permission before they sit in Congress in case they get in trouble. So yeah, there's lots of ways to engage.
I love the idea of young girls leading this movement. That is very, very inspiring, I have to say. The here's a question that I have a couple questions that from people in my family they wanted me to ask you. What is the what's the best daily direct action someone can take to combat climate change?
I think a lot of times when people answer this question, they want the answer to be like, ride your bike, or, you know, recycle, or bring your own bag. Thing that's like really easy and simple. But the answer is like, be politically engaged and be active in your community. Are you starting a compost? Are you starting composting and teaching your neighbors about it? Are you putting solar on your roof and like encouraging your neighbors to do it? It's about building, as Leah Stokes says, who's a professor at UC Santa Barbara, she talks about building these like ever broadening circles of change, right? There's what we can do as an individual, which matters, but then there's what we do as a family, school, as a sports team, as a church, as a community, as a state, as a country. And so the more we can start to think about impacts in those broader circles, the better it will be. So if there's a bill that's coming up, for example, I just saw on Twitter this morning, Surfrider was sharing that there's a bill, I'm forgetting the name of it, that supports our national parks and wildlands. And it passed the Senate and it now needs to pass the House. So that would be a thing where you call your congressman and say, like, this bill is really important to me, that we're investing in our public lands, and we want to make sure that you're voting to fund this. So I wish there was like one easy answer, but it depends like what you're good at and what
exactly
what moment we're in.
What you're good at to this moment and where you are. Somebody I saw said in the comments, have colleges and universities test from the fossil fuel industry, which is of course a dynamite idea, and have done it, by the way.
It's the Great American Outdoors Act. The League of Conservation Voters just commented, and others. Yeah, the Great American Outdoor Act. Everybody tell your member of Congress they need to support that.
I will be doing that. You know, here's a question that my sister sent. She sends me a simple text, but anyway, it says she wants to know why you think that the fossil fuel industry folks are putting profits over survival. Do they really not believe that they and their families will not ultimately be impacted by this? I guess they don't believe that somehow, that money will save them.
So money will buy you time, but it's not going to save you. There's all these people who have like bunker.
No problem. Keep drinking water. I'm going to drink it too. Everybody drink water. It's good for you.
Yeah. Property in New Zealand, or trying to go to Mars, and like this sort of techno-utopian escapism isn't going to work, because where are you going to get food? How are you going to get around? How are you going to get medical care? And so my mother likes to say that the pandemic is, if we're lucky, a dress rehearsal for what's to come in terms of the climate crisis. And in moments like this, you depend on your neighbors. You depend on the people around you, and that's what gets you through. It's the same thing after a hurricane. It's the same thing in a flood. It's the same thing in a heat wave. How are we looking out for each other? And so to your sister's question, I mean, one can only guess what is in the hearts of fossil fuel executives and whether they have a soul anymore, because they are really putting their own wealth and corporate interest over the planet. and they are making that decision with full information. They've had the scientific projections about what their industry is doing to the planet since 1970. So it's just completely unconscionable. And you know, they're running these ad campaigns about now how they support diversity and how they're investing in renewable energies, and it's such a small portion of their budgets. And they got this Trump administration to change the rules so that they could receive stimulus money. They're receiving hundreds of millions, if billions of dollars in support from taxpayer money, when we're at this moment that we could be using these trillions of government taxpayer dollars to support this transition to a green economy and renewable and green jobs, and that money help us to build the world that we need. Instead, they're just being greedy and horrible at every turn. So I don't really understand that level of evil. And so I have a hard time even trying to answer your sister's question.
I mean, vote. Politically, we got to get even more politically active than that we already are. I mean, that's one way to fight it. It's hard. There's no doubt about it. I love that your mother said that this is a dress rehearsal, this moment. That is a very perfect way to characterize this thing we're living through.
My mom's a regenerative farmer, so she has a little piece of land upstate New York, and I'm there about, you know, a week or two a month, and just watching her lead by example is so incredible. She's got 100 or so chickens and all of these different vegetables, and composting and restoring carbon to the soil. By the way we do farming with these big machines tilling everything, it releases all this carbon in the atmosphere because it destroys the integrity of the soil. And then we're losing all the soil due to runoff down rivers. And so it's been really inspiring over the last 15 years since she became a farmer to start to think about our food system and what role that plays in the landscape and the future that we want. That's about 10% of the climate. The cause of climate change is the food that we eat, and another, 15% is formation of land, the destruction of ecosystems. So we always think about like solar panels and electric cars, and our electricity and our transportation are a really big deal, but we also need to be thinking about nature as a huge part of the solution. It's not just technology, it's that, plants are pretty magical. Like photosynthesis is the best thing there is, and half of photosynthesis is happening in the ocean. And so I like to think about not so much only what we need to stop, but also the future that we're building. So we have something to work towards, because all of this sort of like the apocalypse is coming stuff is really scary, but it doesn't really tell us what to do. And so we're getting comments that say, yes, we should be eating plant-based diet, and that's certainly a part of the solution too. And so someone says farts. I would actually correct that and say it is cow burps, not cow farts, that release methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas.
Right.
Common misconception.
Cleared that up. God, there's so much that I want to talk to you about. And I know that in one of your conversations, you were talking about octopus, which are one of my absolute favorite animals of the ocean. And I'm dying to talk to you about that, although I don't know that we really have the time. Maybe I'm going to just have to call you. By the way, did you ever, in your line of work, did you ever get to know a man named Mike Degree? No.
No, I don't think so.
Documentary filmmaker who did a lot of marine work and underwater work. Anyway, he had great octopus stories, but I'll tell you about that another time.
say that I think they're smarter than most of us. If they lived longer, they would probably just kick us off the planet. But they have 3 hearts, and they can think independently with each of their legs. They are just the best, and they can change the color and texture of their skin like that, and sort of mimic their surroundings and camouflage. I just think they're the best. If reincarnation exists, I totally want to come back as an octopus. And so that's like one of the things I will never eat, because I for their intelligence.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to share the side of things that one of the things I'm working on now is starting this think tank, Urban Ocean Lab, which is focused on the future of coastal cities, because coastal cities are really getting slammed by climate change, and 1/3 of Americans live in coastal cities. It's not a coastal elite thing, it's 1/3 of our country. And so we really need to figure out what the future looks like. And so with my co-founders, Marquise Stillwell and Jean Flemma, and my chief of staff, Megan Davis, who sent us a pufferfish emoji earlier. Thanks, Megan. We're starting from this perspective of design. How do we envision and design the future that we want? And then how do we create the policy framework that we need to get that future? So it's both. It's the creative visioning design piece, and then it's also the policy change piece. We need to change the rules of the game. So I see in your pinned message, there's a link to Urban Ocean Lab. If people want to learn more, you can check out our website. And yeah, we're just getting going. And a bunch of people have been also commenting about the Blue New Deal, which I co-created, this idea that we need to be including the ocean in the Green New Deal. It was left out of the initial resolution that AOC Senator Markey introduced. And so I worked with a bunch of colleagues and then with the Warren campaign to create the Blue New Deal plan, which touches on a lot of things we've said about offshore energy and regenerative farming and restoring coastal ecosystems. And there's this opportunity to translate that from a federal level down to a state and local level. So that's one of the things we'll be working on
That
first.
is awesome. Absolutely awesome. And it's such an obvious thing. It's interesting how it was, we don't consider the ocean a lot. It's weird.
Trying to help us. We should pay attention to it. It's also fun to play in. Like, wouldn't it be great?
Yeah. Well, you have a lot planned for this takeover, so to speak, right? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Sure. So, thank you for passing the mic. I'm really excited to be sharing some stuff on your feed for today and tomorrow. So I'll be posting some resources that kind of back up what we've been talking about these connections between ocean and climate and justice, so people can learn more about that. So some articles and videos and that sort of thing. I'll point you to some organizations that are doing important work and other people you can follow. And then tomorrow night, I'll be hosting kind of like a living room chat with some of my favorite people in living rooms across the US, my Black friends who are doing just incredible and important work at the intersection of justice and a whole bunch of different things, from film and the arts to emergency medicine to environmental policy and organizing. So tomorrow from 6 to 9 Eastern, here on your live, I'll be on the top half tomorrow, taking your seat. And yeah, it would be great if people want to tune in and ask us questions. We'll be sort of celebrating their accomplishments as part of the Juneteenth holiday. So stay tuned. We're going to put together a list so you can sort of know who's coming and tune in and get excited. It'll be really fun for me because we're also busy. We don't just hang out and FaceTime each other. So we'll just FaceTime in front of all of you.
I love it. That is so awesome. I love that you've planned this whole, you're so organized and got it all together with all these cool people coming. I think I've heard about a couple of the specifically who they are, and that's, I don't want to ruin any surprises, but you've got a good group of people coming. Really good. All right. Well, is there anything else you want to say before we sign off on our little thing and you take over on this moment?
There is one more thing, and that is one of the ways in which this sort of inflection point in history and American history in our society is happening is that people are doing their homework. There's a lot of people who are reading books about how to be an anti-racist or the history of the US and sort of how we got into this mess. And so there's an initiative happening right now called Blackout Bestseller List, where people are trying to buy enough Black books to have the whole New York bestseller list by Black authors. And so my last Instagram post on my account has a post that has those hashtags and has links to Black bookstores where you can buy these books by Black folks. And I actually have a book coming out in September that's now available for pre-order. It's an anthology of essays by women climate leaders that I co-edited with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson. It's called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. So if people are interested in that, that could be one of your Black books that you purchase. So yeah, I would encourage people to use this as a moment to support Black creators and to do some homework, do some reading. These are beautiful books. So check out my latest Instagram post for some links.
That's
and
awesome.
suggestions.
Will you, once you take over this platform, will you post on mine once you take it over too, that link? Because that is fabulous. What a great idea. I love that. Okay, great. Well, this has been a total treat. I look
for fun. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm a huge admirer of yours. I think you're a rock star, and I'm so delighted that you generously took me up on this moment. So thanks for doing it. And I thank everybody for listening today too. This has been a hoot.
For tuning in. I guess we'll figure out how to share this over to IGTV or into your how to do this.
I do something. I push some button, other one, and it all works out.
I need to learn. And thanks to all my friends who tuned in and wrote me nice, encouraging notes.
It's good.
This is all new to me. So,
all right. Well, listen. Carry on and have fun and millions and trillions of thanks.
Text me.
Okay. Bye.